In the midst of war in Europe, German and Austrian refugees found refuge at the Scattergood Hostel in West Branch, Iowa. The hostel opened on April 20th, 1939. It welcomed almost 200 refugees. This drawing was done by a guest of the hostel during their stay. The hostel was run by the American Friends Service Community, or AFSC. The group was a part of the Quaker Society. Refugees who came to the hostel were considered guests and not refugees. They were considered guests because of the short nature of their 4-month stay at the hostel, and also because the hostel was a place of rehabilitation and not a permanent home. After fleeing their homes and escaping war, the hostel was a safe haven before starting a new American life. The refugees' journey to Iowa was long and arduous. From Germany and Austria, they fled to France and the Netherlands. They were not yet aware of how far the Nazis would spread their power. Again they fled, but now to America. This picture shows the conditions on board the SS Navman. People are sleeping in lifeboats for lack of other space. This ship transported those fleeing from Europe to America. The ship was packed, uncomfortable, and ran out of food for the passengers. The journey took 5 weeks. After the ship's layover in Cuba, the SS Navman and its 1,000 refugees would arrive in New York City. The refugees arrived with little to no money. They had spent much, if not all of their wealth, on fleeing their homes. The AFSC offered them housing in New York before they moved on to their final destinations throughout the U.S. Many of the new arrivals still had family in Europe. The AFSC provided them opportunity to bring their families to America. The first arrivals to the hostel were 5 men. Like most of the guests, they were well-educated, upper-middle-class individuals who were escaping oppression of the Nazis. The American citizens in the surrounding areas of West Branch were uneasy about the prospect of refugees from Nazi Germany coming to their community. This lack of trust continued throughout the existence of the hostel, although the arrivals spoke openly and loudly of their hate of the Nazis. This helped to quell the skepticism, but did not solve it. At the hostel, the guests worked hard. Men and women worked side by side in the field on the farm, during daily chores, cooking food, cleaning, and while repairing the hostel. This equality was new for some of the guests. In their home countries, men did the hard work, while the women worked in the house. This gender equality was hard for them, but it soon became accustomed. Hard physical work was also new for some of the guests, because many of the guests came from the bourgeoisie class. They had not yet become accustomed to the new change in economic and social statuses as refugees. By working hard, they gained new skills which would help them find jobs after leaving the hostel. The American Friends Service Community helped to integrate the guests into American culture in many ways. The group would frequently take trips to Iowa City to show the guests what a thriving small Midwestern city looked like. All of the guests were enrolled in intense English classes. The classes gave the guests the opportunity to be proficient in English, which would benefit them in their new American lives. Those who wanted to learned how to drive a car. Many of the guests had lived in areas of Europe where public transportation and walking were the quickest ways of transport. Cars were simply not needed. Driving lessons were hard for many of the guests. It did not come naturally. The hostel's car, affectionately called Susie, took a beating after the multiple accidents it had sustained. During one given cycle of guests, there were only a few children who could play together. The children were quite isolated from other playmates outside of the hostel, and had a harder time integrating during and after their stay at the hostel into American culture. These children, once they had grown, split their time between the U.S. and their home countries. The Scattergood Hostel remained throughout its existence in the public eye of the surrounding areas, the state of Iowa, and the country. Many hundreds would come to visit the hostel monthly. The Des Moines Register asked visitors to stop coming because the guests were feeling like zoo animals. Due to this request and the large amount of people interested in Scattergood, the guests started writing weekly articles in the West Branch Times called What's Going On at Scattergood. This highlighted the guests' weekly lives. The guests spoke at events and shared their experiences throughout the surrounding community. Many of the guests remember their times at the hostel as happy. They were able to relax after years of hardship and war. Not all of the attention on the Scattergood hostel was positive. Although the public could easily see that the guests were refugees and spoke openly against the Nazis, many people were made uneasy by the guests. They believed the guests would steal jobs from American citizens. Some even believed the guests were Nazi spies, and the hostel was their base from which they would perform covert operations. To combat this distrust, the hostel encouraged the publishing of the guests' stories. Sharing their stories helped to ease the wariness of the public by showing them that the guests were real people who had been through struggles and were clearly in America to search for a better life. The AFSC worked with the Des Moines Register, who wrote articles about the refugees to bolster support for more refugees coming to America, and for the American intervention in the war in Europe. The letter currently shown offers the newspaper thanks from Clarence Pickett of the AFSC. One article written by the Register featured Karl Liebermann, a Jewish World War I veteran who fought for Germany and was gassed by the Americans in the Battle of Verdun in 1918. Even though he had fought against America in war, he left Germany due to the atrocities happening in his home country. After their 4-month stay at the hostel, the guests moved on to their new lives in America. The American Friends Service community found them initial jobs in different parts of the Midwest. Many of the new job placements for the guests were not at the same status as their previous jobs. This came as a surprise to some, as they had been doctors, lawyers, or merchants in their home countries. The AFSC job search was limited by the recent end of the Great Depression. Few were lucky and found jobs at their status level, such as Fred Kurt Schaefer, who became an inaugural member of the University of Iowa's Geography Department. He was a groundbreaking scholar in the field of quantitative geography. He worked as a geology professor at the University of Iowa. He is pictured second from left in this photo. Other well-educated guests were placed in areas not related to their previous profession, such as a university professor who became a ski instructor in Minnesota. In the latter part of the Second World War, more jobs became available as the economy bounced back and more people left to fight in the war. The hostel closed on March 15, 1943, from lack of guests. As the war raged on, less and less people were able to flee Europe in search of refuge. Overall, 185 people stayed at the hostel, but only 20 to 25 people were there at one given time. The Scattergood Hostel remains today a used structure in West Branch, Iowa. The American Friends Service community made a lasting impression on the lives of many German and Austrian Americans today because of their charity and generosity during the war.